this for people that aren't able to make it. Welcome to the workshop. I'll be quick in some of our administrative matters and we'll get right to it. So just a reminder for those of you on the task force that we will adhere to the antitrust admonition that I give at the beginning of all of these. I won't read it for brevity purposes today. I also understand that a number of our task force representatives and perhaps other stakeholders may be in the middle of preparations for the upcoming weather event. And so not everybody is on the call today. As a result, I think what I'd like to do is make as much progress as we can. And then understanding that there are some people that aren't with us right now, we'll send out maybe the version as it stands of the governing document at the end of this meeting. And I'll rely on what ERCOT needs from us, but give people time to look at the final, understanding that we really do need to wrap this up, but maybe ERCOT can speak to when they need to get a final thumbs up from everybody, since we may have people that are not on the call today for good reason. So with that, the purpose of this workshop is to go through ERCOT's governing document draft and provide feedback to them. I want to first thank our friends at ERCOT for doing the heavy lifting yet again on providing a good draft for the next phase. And Catherine, this might be a time that I can call on you maybe to walk us through edits that I think maybe ERCOT has made, and then some edits that the TDUs have proposed. I also, hey Dave, I also got, and I think most of you got these, we saw some edits from Tesla, from Shell, from Taba, and then I have a note from Pecan Street with some comments that I can pull up when we get there. But David, are you going to walk us through, or how do we best want to use our time today?
Yes, so I'm open to options. Sorry, I'm open to options. My expectation was to walk through and lead the discussion initially, to go through the red line. Okay. Hopefully I believe that they're in alignment with what we had talked about, at least within our presentation form in December. But I'll take some time kind of going through it just to see any feedback folks have, and then Jason, I guess my thought from there is for folks to share their various comments that they may have, and maybe they want to pull those up. At least for the case of Centerpoint, what I'll plan to do is when we get to that part of the document I have is the one that includes the comments from Centerpoint. When I get to those, if they're available, I'm not sure they are to your point in terms of winter weather preparation, but if they are, I'll let Jim speak to them or whomever might be available. If he's not available, maybe Catherine can speak at least a little bit to it, and we can go on from there. So I guess with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and you all can see it. All right, is the size okay in terms of the document?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Could you zoom in? Could you zoom in just a bit? Beautiful, thank you.
Sorry, let me try and make it a little bit easier. So, I mean, I'll stop on some of these. Really, a lot of this was actually, I would say maybe the 60–70% of the red lines that we have really aren't substantive changes necessarily to what we're trying to do. They're really more just about updating the language to align with the fact that this is now a phase 2, and just sort of, some of the history and things like that about it. So I won't really spend any time on this, but that's really what all these changes are about. I guess one of the things that we get into as part of the purpose, and you'll see a lot of this phrasing throughout the document, is the idea that as we discussed in the December meeting, really a lot of the changes we're proposing here are couple of incremental changes to address lessons learned that we've had, or to address, particularly the new ECRS participation. So there is really the purpose and the goals and the things that we're analyzing are in many cases staying the same. So you'll see kind of that language throughout the document, and this is an example of that when we laid out the purpose. I guess here's where we capture the couple of things that are changing. The first is to open up participation in terms of ancillary services to ECRS in addition to non-spin. We've talked about some of the changes to telemetry validation process. We sort of had walked through what that was in the presentation, and it was included in the report, but now it's fed into the document here. And then really in addition to that we're going to continue to monitor a lot of the other things that we were already thinking about. So for example, how we wanted to dispatch them. Are we okay just using the zonal shift actors, or do we want to do something that's sort of a quasi-nodal shift actor? And that's been part of the analysis that we've started to get into with at least the couple of ADERs that we have actively participating in the market. Again, this is just a lot of cleanup, and now that we have a phase 2 document, I guess in terms of the timeline, and there's so much red here, it's a little hard to read. I guess the thought is, as we get into phase 2 and we make at least these incremental changes, we can kind of see how things play out over the next 6 months and see then what do we want to drive to. So we want to put some time frame around, okay, it's been X number of months, now it's time to start thinking about, is there anything new that we're learning? Are we seeing increased participation? Are we continuing to see barriers perhaps that we really want to drive into a phase 3? And maybe phase 3 ends up being a case where we start actually thinking about a little bit more long-term system change and things like that would want to be incorporated into the overall pilot work. Let's see. Nothing new here, just really adding in the part around ECRS. Changing a lot of the words from phase 1 to phase 2. I guess here's another case here where we talk about some of the limits on participation. This was just a case where we had talked about non-spin and we added something equivalent for ECRS. Another component where we talked about non-spin, so we added ECRS, talking about the information that we get when we start to receive some registration information. This was a relatively minor update. I'm on the page talking about when we're reviewing the submission, specifically this is talking about the details of the aggregation submission. And I think there was questions around when we're doing our analysis of the submission, we're trying to identify these things as reasons why we would potentially reject the submission. I think one of the things that had come up, and maybe there was some confusion about, is, for example, we see one of the easy IDs that are in the form that are already participating in, for example, ERS. So we had thought that the language was clear, but I think there was still some confusion. When we are looking at the form and deciding whether or not to accept or reject it, we are basing that on sort of the current participation. So we can look and see, is that easy ID already one that we see as a participant in what has sold into or participated in the ERS market. So again, there's, I suppose sort of the first come, first serve, I guess, in terms of which program the participants, the customer is going to participate in. That I think is key here. But that's going to all happen at, when we get the submission, we're going to look at, all right, currently, what is that customer plan to participate in? And if we see them in another program, then that would be a reason for us to reject the form. So this next part is actually getting into some of the changes that Jim, that you all had made. Can I turn it over to you to kind of speak to what you all were trying to do with these language changes?
Yeah, Dave, I'm here. Yeah, thanks. So as we were talking with ERCOT on some of the workflow processes between um, the section above that you were talking about in this section, these two sections essentially um, uh, describe the process for validations of those DOTA forms. And so originally it had a different workflow for new DOTA forms as opposed to the updated DOTA forms that are sent in. And so really what we're doing here is we're marrying up those two processes to where the QSE, when they send in the DOTA forms to the DSP provides its validations, and then we'll send back the approved DOTA form to the QSE. And so if it's a new form, there's an addition. If you wouldn't mind scrolling up a little bit to the part that David was just at. Keep going a little bit. Right here. Okay, so you see in the light blue on that the second bullet point there, the DSP acknowledgement, the QSE supplement, and the DOTA form would go from the QSE. And again, keep in mind these are for the news. So the new DOTA forms would get those would be sent with the DSP acknowledgement and the QSE supplement to ERCOT, and we propose that the DSP and the resource entities are copied on this email transmittal. And so that's to keep everybody that's involved in the same loop. And if you step down to the next section, which we were just at, that is for the updates. And so the thought is to have that same process. So when an update comes through, again, those are sent as close to the first of the month as possible. But that goes from the QSC over to the DSP, again, for the validations. And then the DSP would send out the approved updated DOTA form. And then the QSC would then send that over. And if you scroll down, it's on the bottom. There's some red lines there. So the submitted QSC would then return the DOTA form to the DSP, and again, also copying the resource entity. And so this, again, it's just we saw that there was a gap in that process, and so we closed that gap and made those two workflows the same. So that's really the gist of these changes. And again, it's in the, we took it with the perspective of streamlining and standardizing, as well as using the carbon copy process to make sure that all of the involved entities are in the loop. So that's the extent of our comments, and I'm willing to take questions, or Dave, if there are none, then you can proceed.
Thank you, Jim. I think that your edits, we didn't have any concerns with them. I know you all had reached out to the captor, and so we were definitely okay with these, and we're happy to include them.
Okay. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. So then I'll keep going down then. Again, this is in talking about qualification, just adding the additional points here about providing ECRS in addition to non-spin. And then the language here is specifically getting into the telemetry validation. So we had kind of walked through sort of a three-pronged approach to doing this. And again, the concern here that we were trying to address is when we had attempted to do some of the telemetry validation for some of the first ADERs, there was periods in which the devices were effectively idle. But with the way that the language was written, we were trying to score those, and very minute deltas were being seen as failed intervals. And so we were essentially seeing failures when really didn't feel like there was a legit reason for that to be showing that way. So the idea here is, again, that what we want is to be evaluating specifically periods in which there's actually a injection or withdrawal that exceeds some threshold relative to the max capability of the ADER. For those specific intervals where you're actually seeing some injection or withdrawal, we would then do an evaluation relative to a 10% accuracy. And then the third bullet here is just talking about the fact that we like to see at least 4 hours worth is sort of just the number we landed on, but see some significant number of intervals that meet that condition in one, that we're seeing enough intervals that there actually is some injection or withdrawal that we can feel comfortable that the telemetry is good, and that the test shows that the telemetry is valid relative to what we're seeing in terms of activity at the actual individual devices or premise. So you'll see this language repeated a few times because we talked about slight differences in how we do these overall processes when it's, for example, premise level telemetry versus the device level versus the hybrid. So this is one, I believe this section was talking about if the aggregation was made up of effectively premises and we're aggregating at the premise level. The section below is the same part, but talking about if it was all device level telemetry that the aggregation was occurring at. And then there may actually be a case where we do if it was, yeah, and then there's just one third section, again, all the same language effectively, but the condition in which it's the actual aggregation is a combination of telemetered premise and device level information. Let's see, just a number of insertions of ECRS. For at the end of section D, we see some more of that in section F. For section G, we're not necessarily proposing to make any changes to how performance is evaluated, but this is something that we had noted during the presentation that we did in December. And that is that the way that performance is measured for a CLR, there is a threshold of 2 megawatts. And I guess it's not unexpected, and what we've seen to some degree is that ADERs are relatively small still. And so to the degree they are even potentially less than 2 megawatts, the way the current threshold works is that they effectively cannot be found to not be performing relative to at least this specific metric. So obviously that's something we at least want to think about. Is there some additional or different threshold we want to think about for ADERs that can maybe capture both the potential for large aggregations, but also be useful for smaller aggregations? So no proposed change in terms of how we're going to do it for phase 2, but at least recognizing that there is a gap here that we want to analyze further. I guess lastly, this is going into some of the things that we want to keep analyzing. One of the ones, and this is, I know, Jason, you mentioned Shell having some comments. It was about this particular paragraph highlighted here. But one of the things that we had put in phase 1 is the idea of, in order to stand up the pilot, we effectively had to use some of our existing participation models, and that really included this CLR participation model that is really a resource that is following the 5-minute dispatch. It's following the updated desired base point from those who were on Reshmi's email. And really, it looks like, for all intents and purposes, a controllable load resource. We had noted in phase 1 that, particularly that following of sched dispatch may be a barrier. And in fact, likely is a barrier for sort of the long-term participation of aggregations. And so we wanted to explore and work with you all on the potential benefits of allowing ADERs that are more blocky in nature, or step response type change that we might see, as opposed to kind of that smooth following of 5-minute instruction. So the biggest change here was actually really more about adding ECRS. I think the other things were just sort of trying to add a little bit of additional information. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about is, if this thing is a system change, we'd like to ensure that it has benefit, that we actually will be opening the door for increased participation if we do invest and make the system changes. And my gut is that it would be an improvement, but we kind of like to have a little bit more firm understanding of the potential benefits before making system changes and trying to prioritize those software changes. I think I did have a quick talk with Reshmi. I don't want to speak too much on her behalf. I think her concern in the language that she had been hopeful that we could actually include blocky response type participation in phase 2. I guess what I was talking with her about is, if that does require system changes and that is our expectation, then still would like to consider doing it, but that would be beyond sort of the incremental changes that we're looking for in this phase 2 as it stands right now. I think if we wanted to open if we all decide that makes sense and we want to make some system changes, I think it's worth noting that I don't even think it's necessary just to change to this section. I think there'd be pretty broad changes to many of the sections within the governing document that we'd have to revisit if we have this sort of new type of participation model. Let's see. I don't know that there's really anything else that's substantive. I think, yeah, I think that's the last little change, and that just really is intended to be a clarification. So with that, Jason, that's really the document. Hopefully folks generally see it as in alignment with what we had presented that we were hoping to do under phase 2, but I know there have been some comments coming in, particularly over the last couple of days, that folks may want to talk through.
Thanks, Dave. So you covered a lot of the comments that have come in as you went, so maybe now's a good time to open it up to folks whose comments we haven't gone through. And Scott, if you're on, Henson, you may want to.
Yeah, I can
address
jump in here. So there's a sentence in the section A around the aggregation can't be a net exporter, and then there's an exception in B for that. And when I was going through it, and to be fair, my brain is melting out of my ears through all the DOE applications that I've either reviewed or done in the last 2 weeks. So I wasn't in the best headspace, but those were a little bit confusing to me. And then the other thing was, at some point, I'd love to have a deeper conversation with the folks interested around what metrology we'd want to put in. There's a couple of paragraphs. There's a paragraph about that, and we have obviously deep experience in measuring systems like this across the country. And so that is near and dear to our heart, and we have a lot of lessons learned and pain points that we'd like to avoid other people having to repeat.
I started sharing again, Jason. I guess the reason I did that, I thought it'd be
Yeah, there we go.
helpful. Scott, is this the paragraph you're talking about for your first point?
Yes. That last sentence, the premises that are components and an ADR may provide, let's see, it will be acceptable. Okay.
I mean, I guess the what this was largely trying to cover was actually to some degree this sentence before.
Okay.
I think,
Yeah,
Scott,
because-
maybe it's that last sentence in the first bullet, the one that says that ADER's performance should always be represented as net load. Is that the sentence?
Yeah, the net load. Because you're going to have, especially in shoulder months, like I'm not worried about an aggregation of you know, I'm just practically, if you've got an aggregation of residential battery storage systems, exporting with all those battery energy storage systems, exporting in the summertime in an afternoon, high energy period, I'm really not worried about the aggregation becoming a net exporter by itself, right? That 70%, our data shows that roughly 70 to 75% of those air conditioners are going to be on in those homes at that point in time. So it's going to be really hard to do that. But other times of the year, if you call for a big energy cell from those batteries, you can easily create an aggregation, a net export for the aggregation.
Yeah, and I guess it's probably just been a while, Scott, since we talked about it. I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in what this is talking about. And the key part is for purposes of
that may be
telemetry.
my misunderstanding, so I apologize.
No. No, that's okay. And of course, we've been kind of living this perhaps a little bit more. So the specific key part of this sentence is for purposes of telemetry and other market submissions to ERCOT. So it is absolutely okay that the ADER in aggregate is physically injecting back into the grid. What this is saying is, and for the couple of folks we've been working on it, is this was one of the workarounds for our systems. The participation model we have for aggregations assumes that they are a load. So our workaround for that is we are actually having all of the ADER participants, particularly, well, all of them potentially include some devices that can inject. So for all of the ones we're seeing, we actually have them put a megawatt offset value into all of their submissions. So even when they're physically net injecting, it actually looks like they're still consuming. So as an example, if you had a aggregation that was all batteries and it could do everything from consuming 5 megawatts to injecting 5 megawatts, what we've been asking people to do in your submissions is to actually offset all of that data that you give to us by 5 megawatts. So now it looks like something that can operate between 0 and 10.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
No, it's obviously a good question. It is a little bit of definitely a nuance for folks who are participating. So,
okay.
So, but hopefully that clears that up.
That makes sense because, as I said, if the concern was the actual physical reverse flow of the aggregation, that, I could totally see that happening at periods where those air conditioners aren't, 75, 77% on. Right. So now at other times, I still don't think we're necessarily to the densities where they would reverse flow a feeder. We're seeing that in other areas with solar, but I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of solar systems in a service territory where, the density is approaching 30 to 40%. So that's a different conversation entirely when we hit those kinds of densities.
Yep.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I think that covers everything I had.
Perfect. Is there anything we haven't talked about that the task force wants to talk about?
Are we just,
Jason, I was going to go through my comments as well, if that's okay.
Okay, great. Yep, that'd be great.
And then I think I spoke over someone.
Oh, you're fine. This is Michaela with Taba. I was saying we also would like to run through our comments and open it up for suggestions for discussion, but we can go after Greg.
Why don't you go ahead, Michaela?
Okay, I can do that. Am I allowed to share my screen or do I have to
You
have?
should be. Yeah, you should be.
Okay, let me. Okay, I have to open my system settings 1 second. Oh, it actually, okay, it's saying I have to like restart my computer to do that. So I'll just tell you where I'm at.
I may be able to, do you want me to pull up the document you sent around?
Yes, please. That would be great.
I may be able to do that.
And Jason, if you have an issue for some reason, I actually was just pulling up the comments as well, can help drive.
Okay, yeah, if you want to, that'd be great.
Doing that now. Let's see.
Okay, thank you. I think our first edits start on page 4. So
Sorry, trying to get out of the footer there.
you're fine. So in section 4, policy questions to be considered. Yeah. So we're fine with the original language. Must. We don't really think there's a big change. So our position is that we are okay with maintaining the language as is. I did want to try and put some timelines on some of this. So I added to be included in one of its quarterly reports of 2024. I'm hoping that within a year we can expect to see some progress on that. That's not a hill we're going to die on. So if you think it's going to take longer, feel free to reject that language. But establishing some timelines for some of this would be advantageous.
I'm sorry, that's this part. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was a little further down. I was actually off the screen. Gotcha.
No, you're fine. Yeah, right there. Just must, and then of 2024 to kind of capture that it would be in one of the quarterly reports for this year. If you think that's doable, if not, please feel free to reject that. And then, excuse me, just kind of a comment here is, and if you click on the little comment square, it should pop up so everybody can see it. Yes, there we go. So I'm thinking it would be nice to include some of the recommendations we've talked about regarding interoperability. So we could potentially just add it to this list as a bullet point. I also flagged later on in the document that we could maybe include it in the attestation portion. And we did get some feedback from members that in terms of timeline for interoperability, it'd be great if we could see something on the next quarterly report. I'm not sure if you think that's doable. And then another comment is just, it would be great if we could codify the communication standards in the governing document. We just think that's a tangible action that we can take that demonstrates progress on that. I'm aware that I think some would prefer not to put it in the governing document. And as the new kid on the block, I don't know the history with that. But I'm open to that conversation. I do think there are benefits to including it. So that's some of the feedback we got from members that I wanted to elevate. And if anybody wants to jump in and have a discussion, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just keep going and run through the rest of these. So if you scroll down, I think it's bullet point number 3 in this list. I actually have a question And I think that'll go to you, Dave. So for the ADER modeling with alternative dispatch and pricing schemes, I'm wondering what's the status of that? Has that work been done? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I would say that that work is ongoing. We had actually included in the report and the presentation in December some of the actual analysis around this. So we actually took for at least a couple of ADERs and some of the, the few months of data that we had, trying to do a comparison of sort of what the zonal shift factor is and compare that to what a quasi-nodal shift factor could look like. Or we call it logical resource node, I guess is the term that we used here in the governing document. So far, we have not seen necessarily any major differences of concern that would necessarily warrant the extra work of trying to go to this logical resource node. I would say we had, with just the 2 ADERs in just a few months, I don't know if that's sufficient to say, oh, we're good, we won't ever have a problem. I think it's just something we would like to keep analyzing, now that we actually are starting to see some participation. But there is a section on it in the report that we shared last time that folks may want to dig into.
Thanks for that flag. I see a hand raised.
Yeah,
John?
Michaela, John Bonin here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I would just want to go back one point you had mentioned about, putting the subject of interoperability into this section. I guess that was the first part of this section. Do you have some specific language you were interested in? Oh, I guess it's right here in your comment.
Yes. So that's some language that could get us started. Obviously, very draft. If that's amenable to you, then we could run with it. If people would like to workshop it, I'm definitely open to suggestions.
Yes. I'm representing AutoGrid, and they asked me specifically if there was a place in this document where interoperability can be addressed, because that appears to be a big big impediment in some applications. So I appreciate you bringing this up. And I think it was along those lines, is compliant with one or more communication standards. And I think your suggestion of some sort of a timeline, would that be a timeline for introducing this language into the document, or a timeline for compliance with these standards?
I think introduction into the guidance document, but I'm open to other interpretations. I see Rajiv's hand. He might want to weigh in.
Yeah, just thinking about this, I mean, I think, Michaela, you're talking about two avenues for expressing something on interoperability. One would be incorporating it into this governing document as sort of a requirement through that attestation section that I think you're going to get to later. Two would be identifying sort of a position of this task force in the next quarterly report, that PUC needs to establish some sort of interoperability standards for the ERCOT region. So I think it's sort of like there's a couple different avenues here. From our perspective, we've talked about this a lot, and it would be great to see a nod towards that in this document, whether it is codifying it here or teeing it up for this quarterly report.
Yes, thanks for adding that. And Michaela, thank you for putting this together. I would sort of advocate for that same thing.
Yeah,
Thanks.
just a reminder here on this section. It's a little awkward. It's in the ERCOT governing document, but it's actually talking about what the task force must do. And the task force is able to do whatever it would like to do, whether it's in the governing document or not. So I just want to point that out, that we don't have to put it here. We could, but whether or not it goes in here doesn't mean that we can't address it in a quarterly report of the task force. So I just want to make sure we understand what's in here, and just because it's in the governing document, I'm not sure the task force has to do it, but it is one of those weird things that's in here.
And
Sorry
I
to
see
interrupt, Michaela.
Greg's, no, you're fine. I see Greg's hand up.
Thanks. I think Jason covered what I was going to say. I'm not sure the governance of a pilot project is where we want to impose standards for interoperability. I do think it's appropriate we make recommendations and make accommodations to achieve interoperability, but it sounds like that might be better suited for a recommendation to the PUC or an avenue that can enforce that type of requirement. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Greg. So I think my goal in just highlighting it in the governing document is, well, they say, one of the best ways to meet your goals is to write them down. So that's pretty much what I'm aiming for by including it in the governing document. I think the language we provide can be more or less authoritative depending on our preferences. But my understanding is that it seems like the majority of the task force, does view this as a priority. So I am in favor of including it in the governing document, but we can keep discussing. All right, let's see. So if you scroll a bit further, you'll see all that pink text. This is some language that we got in the vein of alternative participation models. So during phase 2, the ADER task force and ERCOT shall propose or pilot additional ADER participation models to facilitate participation of a wider range of DERs, including blocky resources that are, referenced throughout the document. And then specifically calling out the telemetry requirements that alternative requirements may be considered in those proposals. I'm not sure how big of a lift this would be for ERCOT. I think there is some appetite in our membership to see what our options are, specifically, regarding the telemetry requirements, which have been indicated as being a bit of a barrier. So yeah, we wanted to add some of that language, and I'm open to any comments on it.
I can respond first on it. I think it's largely a question for ERCOT. I think I'm good with this language. I mean, I think the idea is that we wanted to be analyzing this anyways. That was some of the language that I had talked about that we had made some edits around. I think this is just sort of putting more of a emphasis that we really want that to be a direct outcome of trying to actually come up with an actual proposal for a future phase. So my immediate response is that I don't have. I admit I didn't get a chance to look at your language before we're meeting, but as it stands right now, I don't think I have any concerns with this. And in fact, I think that was in my, again, I don't want to speak too much for her, but in terms of the Shell comments, I think that was what she was trying to drive to as well, that really want to emphasize that we do want to move forward to a different participation model that may be less onerous in terms of the sched dispatch following and making it to your point, some of the telemetry requirements and things like that. So anyways, I think that's all I have for now.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, this is just basically saying we're going to look at it and see our options. It's not obligating us to make any changes long-term to the project. So awesome, thank you for that. Okay, if we keep scrolling, section 5. I actually had a clarifying question. So for the second bullet point where it says non-spin and 40 megawatts of ECRS, is that additive, as in that's 80 megawatts of ancillary services, or is it either or? Oh, page 5. Page 5.
I believe. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I jump past it? I guess I thought this was your next question.
No, sorry. It's section 5.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm going to read the language one more time. The idea was that they were distinct. So the ADRs could potentially provide 40 megawatts of non-spin and separately 40 megawatts of ECRS.
Okay. So either. Okay. Thank you. All right. Moving on. So section B, so I highlighted some language there. This is just a question for the task force. Do we think the ALR participation model is working or acting as a barrier? I think, just based on the conversations I've heard so far, that we're open to other participation models. So I don't think we need to dive too deeply into that, unless anybody has specific comments.
Maybe I'll just add that I do think that even is the purpose of why we've had some of the language around the blocking responses, that we were anticipating that would be at least one barrier. So, I mean, I think at least that's where we've tried to capture that concern within this document of at least one thing we know is likely to be a barrier, and can we look at some alternates to that to move forward with the future phase. So I don't know, hopefully that's helpful. But
yeah, thank you. We definitely support that. Okay, so if you continue, so it's still the same section, but I think the last bullet point, we added some language here, basically just saying that, like, we are trying to create an inclusive pilot project, and ADERs unable to provide PFR will be considered for and, when feasible, added to alternative participation models. I know that language is a little bit strong, so if you have some hesitance about that, we can definitely talk about it. But it's essentially just representing our commitment to make sure that we're building an inclusive project and including as many customers as we can. Any thoughts on that? Okay. All right.
Michaela,
Sailing
that
on-
was in my comments as well, but I'll address that in just a moment. So yeah, I support you there.
Okay, thanks, Greg. All right, so if you keep scrolling, page 7, so it's section C under the QSC, so an attestation, yes, right there. So this is where I think it might be good to include the communication standards. I highlighted the ones that we've spoken about before amongst the task force members. And I think a concrete step we could take would be adding it here. It seemed suitable. And I think we should gather, like, if everybody's okay and comfortable with these standards. I don't think we've taken like a concrete vote, but that could be something that we include here. Any thoughts on that? Okay, we'll take some time to mull it over.
and I'm sorry, just real quick on that one too, and it sounds like, looks like maybe Rajita that has a comment there. I will just say that there was some question around how it fits into sort of this sort of a weird place in terms of an ERCOT pilot project or a pilot governing document, as opposed to something that be asking from the commission, all that. I guess I just wanted to note, I think we're open to including those types of things. We will really need some of your expertise on the specific language. I will say specifically for me, that is definitely out of my area of expertise. So I did just want to note that real quick.
Thanks for that.
I mean, I'll just add, I mean, if there is sort of a consensus on adding something like this to the attestation, we would want to kind of work through what the specific language would be, and also probably consider, sort of grandfathering of existing or older systems, right? so those are two considerations here. But at the end of the day, we see this issue. I mean, we've actually had customers reach out to us saying we'd like to kind of participate in your ADER aggregation, but for the fact that you know we can't because we have this given device that you all can't control, and so it really is, in our view, as I've stated before, a major limitation on sort of the ability to create the ecosystem that I think we're all trying to, which is putting the customers first, giving them meaningful choices on which provider they're working with on this stuff.
Awesome. Exactly. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I'm getting at with this. I really want to make sure we're being as inclusive as possible and not, you know, basically selecting certain customers because they have access to certain, you know, products or equipment over others. And I think that this is one way that we can get there. Okay, let me see if that is. Oh, and then I have one last question for you. That's on page 9. So I know 2 adders have been launched and 6 put in for their registrations. I was wondering, what are the statuses of the other 6? If this is a complicated question, I can definitely defer and I can just shoot you an email. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it at a high level. So we have been, I believe we've been meeting our 10 business days for response. I will say we have not necessarily been enforcing hard this next part of it that says, okay, you've accepted, now immediately move forward with the next steps. I think some folks have had some things that they've had to work through and haven't necessarily been able to get to those next steps as quickly as laid out here, but we have not been enforcing that stringently.
Okay.
But in terms, but I don't, you know, in terms of the kind of individual folks and why they may be taking more time or things like that, I'm not sure I have all those details, and probably varies by individual.
Sure. I just wanted to flag, like, if we need to update that 20 business days to better reflect how we're managing it in real life, I'd be open to that. But yeah, I believe that concludes my comments and questions. So thank you so much.
Jason, am I next? If you don't mind pulling
I
up.
think you were next, and then I don't know, Carmen, if you have anything after that, but Greg, you're up.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone who took the time to read the comments. I'm sorry I got them out late last night. I'm going to walk through them at a high level, and hopefully there won't be much left to read. But in addition to the comments, I should say, that ERCOT made, which we very much appreciate, I've introduced some of the language around the voluntary provision of PFR to become more of a concrete opportunity. So right now, there's some language, and I don't see it on the screen yet. I don't know if anyone else can, in the governing document that carried over from the first phase, and suggests that those ADERs that can provide PFR are encouraged to do so. But if they can't, you know, it may become a requirement at a later date. I think the best way to encourage is to create a formal opportunity. Of course, that creates the revenue stream, that creates compliance, that generates tracking of the data that we need as a task force to assess whether or not an ADER is capable of providing a service as critical as primary frequency response. And since the introduction of ECRS, primary frequency response is a separate service and bundled in RRS that can still be dispatched by SCED under an emergency. So in essence, you release your RRS reservation and make it SCED dispatchable. And our ADERs can both SCED dispatch and provide PFR And additionally, they can demonstrate that they're capable the same way traditional resources do today. That's a little bit counterintuitive, but primary frequency response is so fast that it's not even validated by telemetry. In fact, it's validated in arrears when ERCOT has a frequency measurable event. They go back to the meter data. In this instance, it would be device data that is certified to record at sub-second granularity the device's response to that change in system frequency. Now, what's unique about a primary frequency response dispatched aggregation is that it enables interoperability, which I've heard time and time again today as well, that it's very important to the task force, and it's important to me. In fact, one of the more vocal proponents of interoperability suggested that they'd greatly benefit if we could operate ADERs with mixed types of devices. And to the extent that there are other residential storage devices that can both provide primary frequency response and record it, then they can operate in a separate aggregation. My comments go a step further. We have realized that one of the large burdens to proliferating ADERs is in fact the management costs that are spread over relatively small resources, specifically telemetry and QSE fees associated with managing a smaller asset. In the case of a PFR aggregation that's dispatched by system frequency, we'd like to investigate the ability to isolate that PFR response from the SCED obligation. And we don't have a suggestion as to how to do that, nor is it appropriate for the governing documents. In fact, I tried to alter the comments in such a way that made this an option in phase 2 and not an obligation. And I'd welcome any feedback if I missed the mark there. But we think it's important for our interoperability and expanding ADERs of mixed manufacture to have the opportunity to respond to a faster signal than telemetry. And enabling a PFR type program for distributed resources may get to a point where we can have confidence in the device, we have confidence in the data that they're performing to the standards. And most importantly, if we're comfortable that we can do that with less data, well, then perhaps we can scale back the telemetry requirements to enable the aggregations that aren't quite economic because of the economies of scale. From our perspective, it's about 15 megawatts. And that's a very, very impressive scale to reach. We haven't been able to do it ourselves, and despite our best efforts. So short story is, we would like to continue to investigate PFR. PFR can enable aggregations with devices of differing manufacture, and they can enable interoperability without forcing the hands of disparate OEMs with proprietary communication networks to have the precision and physical connectivity to dispatch with that speed. So I think that's all I have to say. I'd love to answer any questions, and I've reached out to a couple of folks who've mentioned how important interoperability is to them, and I'd like that discussion to continue. I haven't heard back from all of them, but if you weren't on my first pass, please reach out to me because I would like to make sure that we're breaking down barriers for competition and that we're enabling different providers to utilize devices and market different programs. And I think this is a no regrets solution to that. But I don't want to make that assumption without your input. And I think it'll make this pilot so much better if we can get to something that provides a valuable service and also enables anyone to do it.
Thanks, Greg. I've got language up on the screen. Hopefully that was the right language for me to pull up.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And welcome reactions to it from ERCOT and others. Dave.
Thank you. I thought I'd actually raise my hand that time instead of just jumping in like I did previously. So I apologize for doing that before. So, and I know, Greg, you had shared at least conceptually this idea with myself and some other folks at ERCOT. I just did want to say that I think we'll have to think about the language a little bit more. I have not had a chance to talk to folks about that. I guess sort of separate from the discussion on interoperability, there have been operational concerns related to distributed resources of kind of any type providing frequency response services. I don't know that much has necessarily changed there, and even a lot of the recent discussions have been focused on those resources providing the ECRS announcement. Obviously, a big reason for why we've landed where we have in terms of the pilot thus far, and ancillary service participation specifically. So we'll just have to think more about the specific language and what we may be comfortable with. I do appreciate in the way that you've written it to at least sort of make it optional, the kind of try and find a way for and time for folks to get comfortable. But just in terms of the specific language, I think we will need a little bit of time internally.
I appreciate that, and we're comfortable with whatever scale, if any, ERCOT is comfortable with, and we've actually recently been scheduling meetings with our hosting TDSPs to try and get some of the statistics around the essentially forced outage rate of participants in our ADER, so that we can get more concrete data around that based on the last 4 months of operations. So that just happened yesterday. We look forward to bringing that back to the task force at a future meeting.
Any other comments or questions on this topic? Greg. All right. Carmen, at one point you had your hand up. I don't know if that was a mistake or if you wanted to chime in earlier and we skipped over you.
Nope, I did have my hand up, but then Michaela covered my topic, which was the blocky resources and telemetry options. So but that language already got reviewed, so I'm all set. Thanks.
Excellent. And I think we've talked about the comments that I saw by email over the last couple of days, but I don't want to miss anything. So did we miss anybody that had comments that wanted to go over? Martha.
Hey, thanks, Jason. Martha Henson from Encore. I just had 3 other things to mention for consideration. I haven't sent these around yet, but I can do that right after this call. And the first one was in section 3 of the governing document that talks about the pilot project timeline and duration. There's a statement in there that says the pilot will continue until implementation of ERCOT market rules and systems are in place for ADERs. And it had been my expectation that any market rules development or systems changes that ERCOT undertook would happen as a result of PUC direction, since the commission ultimately oversees the ADER pilot. And as I read the paragraph in the governing document, it looked like, if that's actually true, then it might be helpful to clarify that, because it leaves it sort of open-ended as far as when those activities would actually commence.
And Martha, I'm sorry, I'm just looking. I had the version. Is this referring to some of was this existing language, or was this something that got added?
Yeah, it was existing, Dave. It's on page 4 under that very first paragraph of section 3. It's the first sentence there that talks about ERCOT market rules and systems.
Yeah, I think the intent of that was to say, well, for example, that if we did not end in a place where, hey, we like this pilot, we like how it's working, let's turn it into something long-term, but we for some reason stopped the pilot but didn't actually have the protocol language yet. So the idea was this would be the governing document or some form, future version of it would be the form for which folks could participate until language was developed, or, and I guess the next part of that sentence would be, or until there was a determination that would include PUCT consultation that the pilot project is not necessary. I mean, perhaps I'm not necessarily capturing the concern. I mean, certainly to the degree we develop any sort of market rules, it would be a function of work with the task force, consultation with the commission and commission staff, and would eventually just even out through our typical stakeholder process be approved by the commission.
Yeah, I think the point is more around who has the authority to tell you to do that, Dave. And it just seemed like that maybe left a little loosey-goosey in the document. I mean, it was my view that the task force can't tell you to do that. It has to be some, direction that comes from the commission ultimately. Once the pilot has been underway long enough, and if it makes sense to proceed with that. So that was really the thing that I just noticed, and it just looks unclear to me as to like what actually triggers the market rules or systems changes. That's all. And it's really ultimately up to you, I think, ERCOT, to look at the edit. I'll send it around so it's a little more specific, but that was really just the comment about clarifying what triggers the development of market rules and systems changes.
Okay, yeah, I guess just that I'm sorry, I have not seen the language yet, but what you're saying, I don't have any concern with generally. So I'm happy to take a look at the language and talk about including it in what we eventually take.
Okay, thanks. And the other two are pretty simple, I think, and I don't think you necessarily need to scroll through because I'll send them around again this afternoon, but it's in the same section that Centerpoint made some edits to that really are just intended to clarify the process or some of the process elements. So one is the second suggestion there is just to clarify that the DSP acknowledgement is only provided during the initial setup of an ADER, not for subsequent changes to an ADER. It might just be helpful to have that described somewhere in that section. I have an idea that I'll send over. And then the last one is just, it would be helpful for Encore, at least, when you talked about that initial 10 business day accept or rejection that comes from ERCOT. It would be helpful if it's possible for the DSP serving the ADER customers to be copied on that response too. As written, it just goes to the queasy. And we noticed, we don't really see much there, or we had to ask for it. And so it'd just be helpful to tag us in there too, in that one bullet point. And those are just the three things that I had to suggest, and I'll send the written document right after this call. Thanks.
Thanks, Martha. Michaela?
I had a quick question for Martha. I'm trying to just get her first comment in straight in my head. So are you essentially saying that like ERCOT won't transition the pilot to be a permanent fixture of our market without PUC directive? Is that where you're getting?
I mean, ultimately, that's not Martha's call, right, Michaela? But
Right.
It had just been my expectation that was how this would unfold. And as I read this language, it doesn't really say that. And, maybe we haven't even talked about that, but that seemed like the right way for, a more official market rule effort and systems changes to be initiated, at least to me. And if that wasn't the intent, obviously ERCOT and Commission won't want that language in there. But that was what I was suggesting be clarified.
Okay, thank you. That helped for my understanding.
Sure.
All right. Anything else?
Jason, I guess I will just want to mention, maybe it's helpful just in terms of next steps. So obviously we've gotten some of the language changes. Some of them seem fairly straightforward for inclusion. I think there's some that I mentioned is that we'll want to think about a little bit more. I think we'll do our best to kind of stew on that over the next few days and see where we can get in terms of providing the material for discussion at PAC. Again, it's not a sort of last time for things to change, but we are expected to provide any material we have for TAC next Wednesday. So I just wanted to give folks a heads up that that's, you know, we'll maybe include some of the proposed language today, but not necessarily all of it. That doesn't mean it won't necessarily make it into what gets taken to the board. It may just really means that we just have need some time to think about it and get it properly included. To the degree we do agree with the proposed language. So just wanted to set a little bit that expectation. In terms of timing beyond TAC, we probably do need to get any additional proposed language in the next, gosh, I'm actually trying to pull up a calendar here. Probably has to happen in the next like week and a half, 2 weeks. And I know that's very tough, in particular with a number of folks needing to do work around preparation for next week. But I think just because obviously we have our deadlines for getting things over to the board on top of, you know, it does likely need some conversation back and forth with whether it's just ERCOT or amongst this entire group, just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of proposed edits. So at least want to kind of start laying out some of those timeline expectations, but maybe Jason, if you or the group have reactions to that, or, you know, thoughts on maybe, do you all want to meet again and have something tentatively scheduled just to see where we're at before that kind of wrap up that final version that we plan to take to the board?
Yeah, I'm open to whether we do it just by email, or we can schedule another Teams call, whatever the will of the group is. So I'll take recommendations if people feel like we want to have another discussion. That works for me, but also happy to do it by email. Any strong preference to get together?
I'm fine with either one.
Why don't we plan on just email communication then, Dave? And if something happens, you know, at any time, somebody feel free to say we need to have a discussion, and we'll schedule it ASAP.
Sounds good, Jason. And I think the one that kind of particularly comes to mind is, you know, there was discussion on whether or not to include additional language around interoperability. Again, that's kind of one area that I don't know that we'll be able to provide much expertise on. So if that's one that the group needs to iterate more on, I think that's at least one topic that came to mind in bringing up the idea of a future meeting. So I guess we'll see if that becomes needed. But thank you.
Yep, great.
Should we bring that discussion of TAC? I'm trying to figure out the best venue too, because I have a feeling we all have our opinions and that might not change or be influenced via email.
I'm sorry, Grace, the question of I'm sorry, just whether or not you should feel free to.
No, just procedurally, like this goes to TAC for approval next, right? Before the board, or is it straight to the board?
Actually, it really only requires board approval. I did get myself on the TAC agenda just as a heads up of where things are at. So it was more information only for TAC, but it will not be a voting item for TAC.
Okay, all right. That probably doesn't make sense. Thanks.
I would like to volunteer to consolidate everybody's edits into one document I think that would be helpful. And then just have people weigh in via email what edits we actually want to go with. And then that way we can provide something a bit more concise to Dave. Does anybody have objections to that?
Thank you, Michaela.
Yep, thank you for offering.
Yep, no problem.
If we don't have consensus, how are we gonna move forward?
Is
I
that's a
meant to
good
refresh myself on the governance for the task force.
that's a good question. I don't think we're trying to get unanimous consensus, just majority, but I could be wrong.
Well, and I guess I'll say, at least on when it sort of comes down to it, I guess this will be an ERCOT document that we are taking to the board. So to some degree, I do think we have to be on board with any of the changes being proposed before we would actually take it as a proposal to our board of directors.
Yeah, and I mean, to be candid, if Dave didn't feel comfortable with my comments, then I would set them aside. But if there's other substantive changes, and perhaps the board is where we resolve that. I don't know.
Okay, well, I'll get to work consolidating everybody's edits into one document and I'll share that with the task force and then we can just discuss electronically, and if we converge on a set of revisions, we can send that to Dave. Okay.
Thank you, Michaela. Anything else for the good of the cause? I appreciate.
Thank you, Ryan,
yeah.
for setting all
Thanks,
this up.
Jason.
Oh yeah. Look, ERCOT's done the hard work. So I appreciate ERCOT, Dave, you and your team continuing to keep us moving forward. And I will look forward to a number of email chains. And like I said, if we ever feel like we need to get together on a quick Teams meeting, we can do that. Just ask as we're having the email exchanges. With that, I think we're done.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks,
Thank you all for the
everybody.
feedback today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.